So week 4, we're talking about diverse expectations. These are expectations that the family has of you as the professional, and different expectations that you might have of the children and the families that come from. I will try to do my best to remind you to follow the lists that I give you either on the PowerPoints under the student tasks or on Blackboard following each list of assignments or folders for the week. So for this week, you'll be expected to complete a practice journal entry, which will include 2 either drawings or other images constructed some other way, and I'll explain what that would look like in a minute, and a reflection. So that's kind of like a 2-part journal entry. And also I would like for you to submit a discussion post for the demonstrate portion and reply to one other student's discussion post. Those 2 are in addition to the normal QQC and self-reflection that I'd like you to submit too. So we're going to go over some types of family organization, different diversity configurations that you're going to find, and then briefly discuss a few communication considerations for these types of situations. So, family organization. The term family might mean a lot of different things depending on who you ask. So you can reflect right now as I'm speaking on what that term tends to mean for you. What types of people arise in your mind's eye when you hear the word family? Maybe not even the personal or individual people that you know, but say mom, dad, sibling, for instance, might be what arises, or grandmother, mother, mother's sister, or something like that. Different configurations come up to different people based on their experiences, of course. When we discuss family and refer to the nuclear and quote intact family, what that tends to refer to is the child's biological parents, married or unmarried, and any siblings from that same pair of people. And there's lots of variation based on that. So a couple of points of statistics. So single parent homes, this is an important thing to keep in mind, because when there's one person doing the job that 2 people tend to share, and that tends to be challenging, stress can go way up. And that doesn't mean it always does, but it means that the possibility for that is there. And so it's useful to know that since about 1970, when the single parent rate or level was at about 11% of the population, it's grown to about 34% of the population as of 2010. Now, that's very useful to know because we can see a trend, of course, when it triples in size like that. And it's also useful to know that half of that set of statistics, half of those families are African American or Native American families of origin. So it's useful to know some of the background of different demographics, so that you might have certain things in mind when you meet different people, not to pigeonhole them, of course, but to give yourself as much information as possible, and enough wherewithal to be able to even consider asking whether or not those situations are true. If you never ask or never think about whether or not a family is single parent or not, it may go unnoticed and you might not ever know. The term blended families includes situations in which there's either step parents or common law couples. That often brings in children from different relationships, so there's a mixed kind of sibling group, step sibling group, and about half of those types of families that have had children from previous relationships, about half of those couples produce another sibling with the 2 of them, so it kind of creates a 3-tiered level of sibling group, 3-tiered sibling group. So they're the 2 individual children from previous relationships, and they each have their own firm footing where they come from, and then a new child that those two interact with each other in different ways. So blended families have those different complex elements to it. Extended family members tend to play a part in different blended configurations too. So I mentioned with the nuclear family, that tends to refer to the couple, the biological parents. But of course, there's lots of instances in which grandparents, which implies a multi-generational configuration, play a part. This is a good bit more common in certain cultures, Asian culture, for instance, and somewhat broadly, on average, the Hispanic cultures tends to include more generations than just two, just the parent and the offspring and the children. There's often a grandparent or great-grandparent thrown in the mix there as well. Foster and adoption situations are also fairly common. About 2/3 of the children in foster care are, quote, children of color. That's a term from the text that we're reading, and it's often the case that the cause of movement into foster care is due to some type of abuse or neglect. They're often removed for that reason or for one of those reasons. Kinship and other types of placement like that is also something you'll find, and there tends to be a correlation between kinship care or other family member care as opposed to foster care that actually shows that that's a little bit more of a benefit for the child overall, particularly in academic and developmental ways. There's over 2 million adoptions in 2010. The texts we were reading are a little bit dated, but that's a statistic from about that time. So that's quite a lot of children who were placed in adoption, and that's good because because they found families. So yay, good for them. And it also points a little deeper to what could be considered problematic, that there's lots of children who don't arrive in this world in the family that they will have for the rest of their lives. And although that can be worked out just fine, there's lots of adopted kids who grow up with just the most wonderful family experience they could ask for, and so that's great. But it does open the door for certain risks too. Another topic regarding how families are put together relate to different things like LGBT rights and growing combinations, let's say, of different types of families. So although there's a lot more emphasis or attention paid to these variabilities, like same-sex couples, for instance, and the laws are changing depending on what state you're in, it still actually represents a fairly small percentage of the total family units in the U.S. So you might or might not come across it in your profession, but if you do, it's good to know that there are different things that they're facing. So for instance, same-sex couples or any other LGBT couple or family group might not have the same assumed legal rights as a couple as a differently sexed couple does. That's been often argued about and been a big motion of contention for public policy more recently. Not legal. It's not legal in all 50 states, but it seems as though that fact is maybe even quickly changing. So it might look a little different even in the next 10 years or so. Now, we've gone over a few elements of what might make a family diverse. And we use the word diverse really just meaning different than what you might be familiar with or what on average might be the case. And diversity can point to something for us, can provide us something, and what that can provide us is a tool or an opportunity with which we might be able to connect with the child or children we're working with. So using diversity or considering diversity to be used as a tool is, I think, a wise way to approach it, rather than it being something that might stress us stress us into thinking that we have to learn too much or learn everything there is about another type of living, another configuration or culture of living. When what it really actually does is allows us not to know certain things. It allows us to be unfamiliar, and becoming more and more familiar or more and more comfortable with that unfamiliar feeling is actually something worth doing, because then we can meet any number of types of people and we start off on the same footing with a comfortable openness to whatever they are and wherever they come from. And that is essential, because if that comfort or ease at least isn't there in a small amount, it's really going to tell. You're really going to be. They're really going to tell. All right. So your openness of communication with different family groups might be well served to be based on something like that. That attempt at being open and comfortable with difference, or with the unexpected. When we talk about social factors, that's just useful to point out the terms majority and minority. They have actually a specific definition. The term majority refers to a demographic of people that account for over 50% of the total population, right? And minority just means the reverse of that. A group of people that are represented by less than 50% of the total population. So that's useful to keep in mind, that that's where the line is, dead in the center. So biracial family groups are definitely more common than they used to be. Around 7% of all births, as of the date of our text's publication, were of mixed race. So this is more and more common of a phenomenon you'll see, and I'm sure you all are fairly familiar with it in your own lives and interactions anyhow. A note on disabilities. Disabilities I cover in a good bit greater detail in a whole different class. Some of you may have even taken. But it's worth noting here that when a family has a child who is given a diagnosis for a disability, there can be responses to that diagnosis that are surprising and sometimes very distressing. So disability diagnoses can tend to move people into what is felt and experienced exactly the same as what grief feels like. Now, grief is looked at in a lot of different ways. When we lose someone due to death, then we might grieve them and go through either a certain set of stages or a certain set of tasks of healing through that. But people can grieve for other things other than an actual person who's no longer living. A person can grieve for the type of person they thought that their child was going to become, for instance, as is the case here when we're talking about children. A person can grieve for the type of person they thought they would become, given their changing life circumstances. So it's useful to keep that in mind, and especially considering the fact that a large number of people are served with special services every year. I've included on the PowerPoint the statistic that almost 6.5 million 3-year-olds to 21-year-olds were served in the year of 08-09. That's a whole lot of people, who are served with those services, and it's great that they have them. It also points to the sheer number of people who have been given one disability diagnosis or another. Okay, a couple of spiritual and religious traditions and rites and customs and things are also something you're going to find in various forms. And I think going back to the kind of maxim to use diversity as a tool might just cover that broad range of possibilities to approach newness with interest, curiosity, a level of acceptance of allowing them to be whoever they are at first. You can think of saying yes before saying no in terms of how you just approach them. Have the mindset of yes, or allow or give permission for people to be the way that they are. Actually starts communication off on much firmer footing. All right, there's a couple of categories of socioeconomic class structure that I've included here. So these are just kind of terms to be familiar with and what they mean. So the upper class, which can parallel what's called the aristocracy in some other cultures, is essentially the very wealthy, and there's a high prevalence of upper class families using private schools. So it's good to know that. Middle class tends to be, this is all fairly broad generalizations, but tend to be fairly hardworking and achievement oriented. So they have goals and want to get to them, and encourage their children to lean into their educational process to do that. Upper working class tend to be more skills trade-based professions, and parents do tend to encourage children to look toward their life, the future of their life, as being wage earning efforts, as having lots of wage earning efforts. Basically, they want them to know that they're probably going to have to work most of the rest of their lives, or at least a good deal of it. The lower working class tends to have a lower educational experience and lower skill level. They tend to work in lower paying jobs. These are all factors that lead to their stratification with the lower working class. And both types of working class, upper and lower working class, tend to have authoritarian parents, or parents with authoritarian parenting style. Now, you can think of parenting styles as very broadly being broken down into about three categories. One is basically permissive, where parents get walked over and don't set very firm boundaries at all, and the children basically do what they want most of the time. That's on the bottom end. The top end might be authoritarian, which is basically my way or the highway. Very little flexibility, harsh punishments, or just more stern or harsh types of interactions. And somewhere in the middle can be something that's called authoritative rather than authoritarian. Authoritative has a degree of flexibility, but also has certain boundaries that are fairly strong. That tends to be where parenting can be seen to be most efficacious and lead to a little bit higher degree of likelihood that there'll be a secure attachment, for instance. The underclass, as it's called, is basically where people are stuck in what can be called the poverty cycle. So there's very little money, little income, often welfare system involvement, governmental assistance. Children are very at risk in these families for different reasons, and part of that includes their stuckness in the poverty cycle, which can lead to much lower school attendance, homelessness, toxic stress, which is just bad for everybody and everything, and so on. Okay, your practice assignment might be a little bit strange, and what I hope for you to get out of this is just a little bit of self-understanding, or broadening of self-understanding. So what I want you to do is construct an image. You can hand draw it, you can use computer program, you can model stuff and take a picture. I don't care what it is, just give it an image, like make an image of it. But the image I want you to make, I'm calling an identity mountain. So I want you to create or draw or produce in some way the image of a mountain range. That means like multiple mountains or multiple peaks. And for each of the peaks that you provide, I want them to be appropriately tall, and label each of them, and you only have to have a few, with some aspect of what you consider to be your identity, right? So that could be an aspect of your culture, an aspect of your ethnic heritage, your language, your socioeconomic status, your educational status, whatever you think of as you, or important parts of you, what makes you who you are. Give each one of those peaks a label representing that. Okay? So make the height of the label representative of how important it is to you. So when I say, who are you, what makes you up, one of the first things that comes to mind should be the highest peak. Okay? So if I were to say, when you ask me that, family, like husband, father, I might have the tallest peak of my mountain be husband/father. I might also think teacher, therapist, musician, and those will be different peaks or of different heights given how much of me I feel those describe. Okay? And I want you to think about how much it plays an important part of your daily life. Now, as a part of that image, I also want you to construct what will be an inverse or mirror reflection of those mountain ranges, or that mountain range, in just an imaginary kind of lake beneath it. You don't have to worry about drawing the lake so much. Just make the upper part of your image the actual identity mountain that represents you, given the different heights of the peaks, and then below it a mirrored image of that mountain. And what I want you to do is put the labels as what you would consider very, very different from the top mountain range. So the top mountain range is you, and then there's a mirrored reflection. Imagine like that it's mirrored in a pond or something, or a lake. And say, for instance, if I gave you the example, I think, of language. So if I'm an English speaker, and for some reason that I felt like that was encapsulated me strongly, I would make a high peak of and label it English or English speaking. And the opposite or inverse peak I might label it something as different from English as I could think, Mandarin or something like that. And I would label that Mandarin or some other what feels like very foreign language to me. So I want you to do that for each peak that you labeled for yourself. And then I want you to imagine yourself, this is kind of like what philosophers call a thought experiment. I basically want you to just sit still and allow your mental movie to start, imagining yourself living a day with the mirrored identity. Imagining myself in this state doing whatever I do normally, but being a native Mandarin speaker, for instance. And given whatever peaks you labeled, consider what a day in your life would look like. And I want you to, as a journal entry, share some reflections about what challenges and what benefits might come from that mirrored identity. Okay? And so I encourage you to maybe just spend a full 2 or 3 minutes, which doesn't sound like a lot, but sitting still and quiet, it actually feels like a long time. And imagine you going through your day, waking up, getting your coffee, doing whatever, driving to wherever you go in the morning, interacting with your family or whoever you interact with, and imagine how this inverse identity would impact your daily life. And I want you to share some reflections about that. I do want to see your images. I won't grade you on how well you colored in the lines, so to speak, but just show me what you did, okay, so I can kind of see what a process looked like. Okay, I have just one more thing to briefly go over, and it's just a few communication considerations. This is a communications course, so we're going to go into a lot more detail about communication, of course, but what I want to do is set some flags out there for you to consider. Nonverbal communication, which we'll also call non-symbolic communication in this course, is essential and vital to rich communication that is purposeful and intentional and beneficial. So there are different trends of assumed nonverbal expectations, and you need to know that. And that doesn't mean that when you meet someone from South America that there are definitely things you already know before meeting them and talking to them that they assume you'll do nonverbally. That's not true. There are, though, averages, and there are general assumptions you can make and test out. And if they don't go well, or if they don't seem to fit, then you can change them, right? But for instance, in many aspects of Asian culture, direct eye contact might actually be a sign of disrespect rather than respect that it kind of tends to be in our blended American culture, for instance. On average, of course. Lots of people who are born in America were told, don't look adults in the eye when you're a child because it puts you on the same level and that's disrespectful. But some of you also might have grown up being told, look me in the eye when I talk to you because I want to receive your full attention. And that's your show of respect. So that's just an example of how nonverbal communication can look very different depending on where you're from or how you were raised. Also, an obvious difference in how people communicate is language. So if you don't speak English first in life, you might have a harder time with some of the nuances of colloquial language. Maybe not. Maybe picked it up really early and flew with it, but there might be some difficulty there. It's worth noting that about 10% of all students in the U.S. In 2010, about the date of that publication of our textbook, were English language learners. Okay, most of those were Spanish speaking. The phenomenon of immersion is useful to know. Basically, immersion is when you take a child or an adult that doesn't speak a language or doesn't speak it well and splash them down in a sea of people who only speak that language. It's actually shown to be one of the best ways to learn a new language. If you want to learn French, go live in France for a month or something like that. But if that's not a holiday, that you want to be able to learn French, and you're actually trying to go to school and work, make enough money, and learn all the things that school teaches you, that might actually be relatively stressful. So it's at one time a benefit to be able to learn 24 hours a day, or at least all the hours at your school, but it's also can be a great drawback because it can be a hindrance in a lot of ways. It's really important also to consider the fact that in our professions, we're going to be really honing in on what's called the person-centered approach to relationships. And person-centered wording means I'm looking at you, a person who has these attributes about you. One of them might be that you learned a different language first than the one I speak. And one might be that you are experiencing a disability in your life. Another might be that you come from a certain type of family, right? So that's a person-centered approach rather than saying that a person with Down syndrome is a Down syndrome person, or a person who speaks Spanish is a Spanish-speaking person as their identity. That's like, the core part of who they are. They're important aspects of who people are, but when we approach someone, we need to be careful to word it in such a way that they know we see them first as a person and that they have these attributes that we also acknowledge. All right, lastly, I want to make a quick note about compassion and empathy. When we move into what I consider something like either service professions or healing professions or person professions, therapy, teaching, things like that, social work, our currency is relationships. And what that means is when we move through providing service, it's not a product that we manufacture and hand over and then we're hands off. We're engaged and involved in the person, and the relationship we create with them is the product. Now, that's the same whether you're a teacher or any other profession that's like a service or healing profession. Because anything that you're able to do with that person is built on that relationship, or rather it's better to think of it as having grown out of that relationship. It's a almost stereotypical kind of analogy, but the relationship you make with all of the students or clients you'll ever work with actually provides the soil and nurturing environment, hopefully, out of which knowledge, wisdom, healing all come in their lives. So compassion can be thought of as literally meaning suffering with. The prefix com means with, and passion can mean something like feeling. It doesn't always mean what we tend to think of as passion as being wild and full of something like joy, although it can. Passions refer to deep feeling. That could be the gamut, very deeply sad feelings or overwhelmed with joy feelings. So compassion means we put ourselves with them and we think of ourselves as they might think of themselves. Try to feel what they feel as they're feeling it, rather than imagining what we would feel if we felt it. That's like the difference between sympathy and empathy. Now, empathy, I've put the word embodiment in your PowerPoint. The reason I've done that is embodiment means, if I were to coin a phrase, it means embodying. So you're living in the body and you're bringing your experience to that living in the body. Embodiment is important with empathy because the portions of the brain that make empathy possible actually serve the function of taking in the input of our inner organs in our body and telling us what we're feeling. So the heart, the lungs, the intestines, the stomach, all the hollowed organs in the viscera, that's the torso basically, all give their information to the brain in various ways, and one of those is called the insula, specifically the anterior insula. The insula is in the front. And that's a really, really important part of the brain related to empathy. When we feel what another person feels, not as we might feel it if something were to happen bad to us, for instance, but as they're feeling it, and we feel it with them in that moment. Those are just deeper parts of relationships that you might experience. And that can be hard too, because compassion can toss us around. And there's a phenomenon called compassion fatigue, in fact, that therapists and teachers and doctors and stuff sometimes experience when they feel so with their patients and clients and students that eventually actually wears them down. So it's something that you actually need to protect yourself from. All right. Lastly, very lastly, what I want you to do for your demonstrate assignment is to look on page 31 in the teacher's guide. There's a chart for nonverbal communication, listing a lot of aspects of nonverbal communication. This is an experiment, and we'll do a few of these throughout this course. I want you to choose some aspect, one aspect of that chart of nonverbal communication, bodily stance, facial expression, eye contact, and so on. Choose one of those, and during your day, I want you to choose one day in the week, and through the whole day, I want you to experiment with using that aspect in a different way than you're used to. So with eye contact, if I'm a person who has a lot of difficulty looking people in the eye, or it feels uncomfortable for me, for that day I'm going to try to bring my gaze up and look more directly into the center of someone's eye, okay, as I'm talking to them. Another example might be touch. Now with touch, you of course have to be fairly careful because some people don't like to be touched, and some people very much don't like to be touched. So I don't want you to offend anyone or get yourself in trouble. But if you're in a conversation with someone that you felt close enough to or comfortable enough with to be able to just gently put your hand on their back or their shoulder or something as you're getting up to move past them, or as you're leaning into a conversation that there's some strong emotion from, or something like that. Try to experiment with it, and then I want you to record what you noticed in a discussion post and reply to one other person's discussion post. Tell me what you noticed about it, how hard it was, if you learned something from it, something like that. Or if anything funny happened, I'd love to read about that too. So the QQC and the self-reflection are at the bottom, the end of the PowerPoint. Give me an email or a call, or a couple of you have texted me. That's absolutely fine. If you have any issues or concerns or questions, or to clarify anything like that.